Hello, everyone. Today is May 15th, 2022. I'm here today with Nicole Evangelista. Nicole is a doctoral student. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Nicole.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You're welcome. I'm excited for you to be here as well. So, we were talking about your kayaking
Yes.
adventures through Florida just before the recording.
Yeah, my favorite pastime. You never know what you're going to see, and it's just a nice break, I think, from everything else, and a good place to clear your head is in the clear water. But yeah, it's beautiful. I think I was telling you I saw the manatees, gators before. I've seen some monkeys, otters. You never know what you're going to see, so it's pretty cool.
That is cool because it's like kind of a jungle-esque environment in the USA.
Yeah, yeah. I honestly had no idea this existed until I moved here, and I try to go as often as I can.
Wow. Is it common for people or in Florida? Do they go out, or is it like the snowboarding of Florida, going out kayaking?
I think it that fishing, like people just like to be out in the wilderness. Um, I know that a lot of people will go camping even here, which quite frankly in the summer is not for me. It is way too hot and humid, but it's definitely very different nature than what I'm used to in California, and I've been really enjoying exploring it. And one day when I move from Florida, I'm gonna miss that the most, I think.
The kayaking through the nature or the
Oh
nature
yeah,
itself?
all of it, I think that, or the nature itself, but kayaking through has been, I think, my happy place, if that's the best way to put it.
That's good. You could find a happy place in that.
Yeah, yeah.
So you moved from California to Florida 4 years ago, you said?
Yep. So August 2018 is I moved for graduate school. So I have been here ever since, and through COVID, through all of it. So yeah.
What were so
Oh,
continue.
go ahead. Go ahead.
What were what were the biggest culture shocks moving to Florida for you?
So I think, if anyone was to hear someone move from San Diego to the north central Florida, you can imagine that it's quite different. I'm no longer, 2 blocks from the beach. I think just generally speaking, I'm surrounded by a lot more of rural areas. And so the communities here are definitely more rural. I grew up in the Bay Area in California, so I was kind of used to seeing a lot of people that looked like me as well. Even though I was living in suburbia, there definitely was a greater Asian population, which is not the case here. And then the other thing is going, a lot of football fans, a lot of football fans. So yeah, it's something that has taken adjustment. I wouldn't say I'm fully adjusted even after 4 years, especially two of them being predominantly quarantined,
Yes.
and not being able to explore as much. But I think generally speaking, like moving to Gainesville is very different than moving to one of the surrounding areas. Gainesville is a university town. And so it's kind of like its own little bubble within the surrounding area. But in my graduate training, I've served a lot of the surrounding communities. And it is, I think, just been really good to recognize the diversity that exists, the different communities within the area, the heterogeneity within that, and how different it is than, Silicon Valley, San Diego, but also some of the similarities there. So it's some things are similar. I've kind of thought about, but most of it's very, very different.
Wow. I can only imagine. That's funny, really funny that one of the biggest points you say is that there are a lot of football fans there.
I mean, there's a lot of football fans in California, especially growing up in the Bay Area. We had the Niners and the Raiders, but having a college team, going to
Yes.
UCSD, we had the the shirt in the bookstore that said we were undefeated, but that's because we didn't have one. So
Oh,
going
wow.
to going to a school that's an SEC Division 1 big sports school. It's been that was a big culture shock in and of itself, but that was an exciting one.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it was exciting. And another one that you said is that this last year I was considering moving away from California, but something that you alluded to is the homogeneous, the diversity in California. It's really nice. And, you being an Asian American, you know, it's nice to have that diversity there, have people that, are similar to you, but also many people that are different, but just even that small amount of similarity can really be comforting.
Oh, absolutely. There's a sense of community that you don't even realize is based on those identities in some ways because it's just a natural part of your life. I think specifically after the Atlanta murders in March 2021, uh, trying to find my community here was a lot more challenging. And talking to people back home was really helpful. But trying to build the community here in Gainesville was something that I've been actively trying to do ever since. Um, I think I've become much more aware of racism, acts of hate, etc., that occur directly towards me since moving here, and reflecting on times that I maybe minimized that throughout my life and my childhood, just because it was normalized. It was something that I had a community that were like, oh, yeah, that's kind of what's happening. We would even joke about it, maybe some internalized racism towards ourselves. And then moving here, it kind of forced me to get outside of that bubble, outside of that safety net of having that community, and then kind of facing these things without having anyone to process it with. I've been really fortunate, especially in the last year, to start to really build that community again more directly. So in Gainesville, rather than having to call my friends and family across the country. But that has, going back to your earlier question, I think that's been the biggest culture shock for me.
What's that?
That, not having that community and kind of feeling, um, I think of it as it's the first time I've ever actually felt like a minority was when I moved here.
Wow, that's very interesting the way you describe that. And when you say the Atlanta shootings, those were targeted towards Asian
Yes.
Americans?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we've seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, racism, et cetera, in the context of COVID, even though that's been longstanding. It's just COVID kind of has exacerbated that and brought it out. And that there have been more headlines that we're seeing. We're seeing more media coverage, even though, like, did you see the media coverage for the Atlanta murders?
Not so much.
Right. So it's still less than what other things are. So I mean, growing up in California, even it's like we were so far removed from a lot of the I think the day-to-day racism, but also in the Bay Area where I grew up, I feel like I was also assimilated so much to kind of the white or central culture there. Um, and I wasn't aware. I wasn't actively like seeking out information. I wasn't, opening my eyes to the things that were probably, going on around me. It's not like these things aren't happening. It's just not something we talked about. So,
No.
yeah.
And when we're children, you normalize it. I mean, you just take what life gives you and say, this is life. And I have very little control over it. And so this is what it is. And even defining it, like, there were contexts in my childhood where I didn't feel comfortable in doing some things that, you know, white Americans may have. And
Hmm.
I just felt, I was Middle Eastern American. There are certain standards of what I'm allowed to do that, if I push that boundary, that person is pushing, I don't know if the outcome will be the same. I don't know if the reaction towards my action would be the same as the reaction towards their action. And that was never like I always thought of it in some way, but I never described it. I never spoke about it. I never thought that was abnormal or maybe not a correct way that to be thinking for myself. And something in the last 2 years, especially the last 2 years since, you know, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and since the massive just rise in willingness to say something and do something, it's very empowering.
Oh, empowering is absolutely the right word. I mean, I don't know if you feel this way, but it's almost as if like thinking back on those internal conversations you're having with yourself throughout childhood, like what you were saying just like really struck a chord with me because I feel like I can relate, but it's almost as if we were gaslighting ourselves.
Yes.
Like saying that, oh, this is weird to be thinking like this, like something's wrong with you to be feeling this way. Are you just being paranoid or overly sensitive? When in reality, it's just, these aren't things that we named directly. And like similar to what you're saying, it was in the last 2 years that I feel like I actually started to process those experiences a little bit more and put a name to it. Didn't really recognize it for what it was. I even in a situation where I felt like I was surrounded by people that may have had similar experiences. Um, but growing up in, white suburbia, to just say it bluntly, it often felt like a pressure to kind of fit in. So it was that internal monologue that you were describing is definitely something that I had then and I continue to have now. And quite frankly, people say directly to my face all the time. So
Say
it's
what?
like that, exactly what you were saying, that why are you feeling this way? It's something like you're being overly sensitive, or like, the way that you were talking about thinking through those experiences is kind of still true to this day, and is something that people that I have in my life, even now,
Yes.
will say directly to me if I voice how I'm feeling out loud.
And what do you think about that when how do you react to that?
So I think it's been helpful, kind of in the same way you were saying, is to name it.
Yes.
So that's a microaggression, that's invalidation, that's gaslighting. And so I've had a really admittedly hard time with that, especially when I don't have as much of a social support or network that I do back home. And a lot of these people are people within my network here. And I don't want to burn bridges. I don't want to cause anything. And, you know, I'm, and it makes me think about what are the long term consequences of me actually confronting this. And I've experienced that. I've experienced, downstream effects of me having a one-on-one conversation saying, "Hey, that was really invalidating." And then it kind of disrupts a friendship, it disrupts a working relationship, and then it kind of moves forward. Um, it's hard. It's really, really hard. Um, I don't have an answer for that. To be honest, I think the main thing I'm trying to do, because I'm still learning, is find people that will be a good support system. Um, and I think connect with people that would be able to understand those same lived experiences. Because that's the hardest thing, is if your support system is only people that have never experienced it directly themselves, then it's not as meaningful of support or as strong a support as I think could be. But that's fueled a lot of my other work, and a lot of what I've tried to do in the last few years is figure out how can I also be that support system for others.
That's huge. And if it's if we need a support system, it's important that we go find it. And I think you're right. If people have are able to put themselves in our shoes as easy as possible. Usually that's people who grew up in the same environment as us, you know, people who've had similar experiences as us through childhood, through college, and even today. But, you know, I can't even imagine. And it's something that like I've contemplated. I'm like, hey, maybe I want to leave California. But then I say, oh, if I go to, say, Colorado, the level of diversity there is dramatically lower. And so I wouldn't have these incredible culture. I have many white American friends, many. My entire childhood, I was surrounded by white Americans, all of them. Most of my best friends are white Americans, but I cherish the diversity. I cherish having Middle Eastern Americans around me. I cherish having Asian Americans around me, Black Americans around me, and we all have that sort of experience where it's like we're different. We're different in some way. We grew up different. I listened to a podcast with a Korean American who described his childhood as having one foot in his Korean world and one foot in his American world. And it wasn't until for him joining the military where he actually felt somewhat comfortable in one realm. And that was for me, it was playing football because then I could just be surrounded by, white Americans, Black Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Middle Eastern Americans, and assimilate. But it's still tough as a child when you have two different cultures that are pretty different. One's in your house and one's in your school, in your extracurricular activities, and then balancing it out seems much less seamless than for someone whose parents and his parents' parents, and for God knows how long their lineage has been, maybe 5 generations of Americans. I feel it seems a lot more seamless from the outside. I don't have that direct experience though.
Have you ever sought out specifically, I think, communities that reflect your own identity?
No. What is that?
So, do you feel like you have specifically sought out relationships, friendships, anything with other Middle Eastern Americans?
What do you mean by sat out?
Sought out. So, like, have you
Sought out.
specifically tried to make those relationships with people that may have shared your identity and your experiences?
Yes. Yes, I have. And it comes very naturally. It really does. Like yesterday, I went out to a concert and found, believe it or not, 8 Persian men from my high school. I did not expect that, but a large portion of the Persian males from my high school were at a concert I just happened to be at last night. And I talked to this other Persian man about he's same age as me, 28, 29, and we just talked for 30 minutes straight without effort. We talked about just you know everything, and yes, I have sought it out, and it's very comforting. I'm not sure if it's because we have the same experience, the same sort of like parents who maybe changed the influence in our thought patterns, but yes. Have you? So you said that in the last year you've done a lot of work within your community regarding what has that work been about?
Yeah, well, I think in the same way that you're saying it's effortless, it's like almost this feeling of safety, would you say?
Yes.
Of being with people that kind of mirror your own experiences, your identity. They just get it. Um, it's like you don't have to have these extra layers of explanation. Um, and I think if I'm being 100% honest and thinking about and reflecting on my life and, especially these last couple years, personally, I have done a lot of reflection on my own identity. So I am half Filipino and I am half white, Jewish. My mom's side is Jewish. I am cisgender. My pronouns are she, her. I am heterosexual.
Can we
And so,
define
yeah.
cisgender real quickly?
So, yeah, absolutely. So, cisgender is where I identify as my gender as the same as my gender assigned at birth. So, sex assigned at birth. So, I am uh, female, she, her. So, it's the same. So, cis being the same as my sex assigned at birth. And other pronouns that people may use can really span. It's a spectrum. And you can think of, non-binary folks are those that don't fit within those black and white categories. They, you know, a cisgender male would be he, him, for example. When we think of pronouns as they, them, it's typically non binary, but sometimes people might feel comfortable with any pronoun. And so I think when we're thinking about your question of what have I done in the community is one thing is trying to educate myself personally and have my own reflection with my own identity because I think a lot of advocacy work is best done when you are sure of your own experiences and identity because that's what fuels a lot of that. Um, I never really fully, I think, sought out Filipino experiences. I very much identified as an American. I very much loved each part of my identity, but it's not something I actively wanted to learn about, educate myself about. I thought of myself as a Californian. I thought of myself as growing up in the Bay Area. And more recently is when I think I've taken an interest in really fully understanding what has gotten me here. What are these aspects of my identity that informs the experiences I've had? Because ultimately, history and how the different aspects of my identity have fit within this system informs how I am treated, how I treat others, where I fit in society, and how I can act within society. And then also that informs how can I act for change in society. So I think about the layers of identities that fall under the oppressed category versus privileged category. And I have many of each. Like I come from a really privileged background. I was in, an upper middle SES. I grew up without many significant financial concerns. To my knowledge, my parents, if they listen to this, might say, maybe not. But
Yes.
I always felt like I had financial security to a degree. I was able to do a lot of activities I wanted to do. I never felt like I was, like I said before, like a minority. I had people that were around me that reflected a lot of my beliefs socially, politically. I had people that reflected my identity. Here, I've realized that that's not always the case. So one thing I've done is try to build that community in my program. So reaching out to other AAPI students, so Asian American Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern students. Um, and we have created kind of our own safe space and social support group to kind of talk through our experiences moving to Gainesville, Florida, when there aren't a lot of people that reflect our identity. And similarly with the Jewish students here, I have never felt like I had as strong of a Jewish community as I do here. Um,
Wow.
and then I think in those conversations, I've learned so much from each of them, as well as my Hispanic and Latina friends who have really taught me about the Florida history. So there's actually something that you brought up about, thinking about moving from California. that makes me think about one conversation I have with someone, which is, oftentimes we think of, oh, why would I want to move to the South? There's such a stigma surrounding the South, in terms of racism, in terms of legislation that is actively oppressing the people there. And, you know, since moving here, I realized like that exists everywhere. That existed back growing up. It just wasn't so in your face, but it's not like it wasn't there. It's not like the same system was there. So if you think like your hometown, and you think about the people that um, lived in different parts of the town, and depending on the different parts of town, what kind of gas stations were available, what kind of grocery stores are available, what types of stores just in general are in what parts of town. I think like Gainesville's a very segregated town, where the east side is lower SES, marginalized communities, et cetera, with not as much access to those same kinds of stores, like basic resources, healthcare resources. The bus routes don't always, there's not as many directly to the hospital, like things like that. And so, I just started rambling. I have no idea where I started at this
I
point.
understand.
But it just makes me think about, when I used to say that all the time, like I can't believe I'm living in Florida, get me out of here. But these things exist everywhere. It's just maybe more prominent in certain areas that don't have the support in order to build the resources, access to the resources, and they don't have the, legislative political support. And I think it's so important to think about that and figure out ways to support those communities. Those are the communities left behind. Those are the communities that suffer the most from oppression, marginalization. Those are the communities that were most impacted by COVID, et cetera. And if I was to talk to myself from 5 years ago, I'd be like, hey, open your eyes. Like, it's not about you. Um, you can use your experiences to help inform how you might go about things, but the world is bigger than just your bubble. And, you know, uh, it's it's hard reflecting on those things. Like, I don't know, how often have do you feel like you think about those things on a day-to-day basis?
Purposefully, not very much, but
Right.
non-purposefully, very often.
When you say
Maybe
not when you say purposefully, not very often, why is that?
because, like you said, it's tough to define, it's tough to face. It brings a it requires work, which a lot of people don't want to put in that work. And it's not like easy, thoughtless work. It's like tough, not really, a lot of analyzing, a lot of questioning, possibly changing habits and systems in our life, and really going out and searching for it. There's got to be other reasons I haven't done it though, too.
Yeah.
It,
Have you
it
thought about it as like self-preservation in a way?
I think as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, I'm very lucky to still live here, to be born here, and to have really never moved from here. Because I think one of the reasons I don't think about it so purposefully is because there are Iranian Americans everywhere around me right now. Like, I'll go on a walk and I'll hear two old men speaking in Farsi. They're my dad's age, and they're just, here in San Diego, just randomly walking. And so it's been a lot easier. I haven't been thrown into that environment where you've been thrown into, where it's like, I'm not going to get that. I'm not going to just walk down, to that trail right next to my house and find a Filipino person or a Jewish person or a person of color or a minority without, definitively. But I think I've grown a lot prouder of my Iranian heritage in the last year, 2 years. And I think it's very similar to what you said. Like, I've thought about myself as a Californian. And when I talked about having one foot in, one foot out, and then having both foot in, those both foot really took my feet came out of the Iranian culture and went straight into the American culture because that's where I felt safe. And I think you did too. You felt safe there. And so now, like you're saying, you're more sure of yourself, which I think you also mentioned in order to help your community, you had to really learn a lot yourself. And I feel like for myself, do a lot of work in being able to recognize my differences and realize that those aren't bugs, those aren't bad differences, those are features, those are good differences that can be highlighted. And now that you speak about it, I could reach out and something, for example, like with this podcast, I've reached out to a few Iranians who I felt, who I don't know, and I felt a lot more comfortable reaching out to them, asking them if they can be on my podcast. And I feel like they've been a bit more receptive to it too. This may be a professor from SDSU or, a comedian on Instagram who is actually pretty successful with his content creation. And those avenues of connection, like, you're Iranian American or you're Iranian Canadian, we come from a pretty similar background. Like that person's comedy is I can relate to it very well. So I think, and even last night when I told you I spoke with, when I ran into those Iranian men, that was very comfortable for me. And I tried to, and I've been reaching out to them too. I guess I haven't been so strong with it the way that I think you have in the last year. And I might attempt to strengthen those connections.
That that makes me think about what you're saying, like the one foot in, one foot out, and then kind of just jumping both feet in into the identity that feels safest. And I think that when you forge those connections with people that share your identity, then you can feel like you can have both feet in that area. Um, and where you're not surrounded by that community, you don't have that constant level of same support and connection. It's pretty difficult to have both feet in that area. And you know, you saying how proud you're feeling and how you've increased that pride, that's really cool to hear. And I think I that resonates with me that it's not like I never wasn't proud to be a Filipino American, a Jewish American, like I always have been proud, but I never fully, I think, understood why. Like I don't think I fully understood the full history that got me here. I didn't understand the aspects of those cultures that are so unique and should be celebrated. And I don't think I fully understood how those informed my parents' lives, my grandparents' lives, and how that in turn, informs me in all parts of my identity. And so I've been purposely trying to take that time to learn more. There's someone from UCSD actually, who has created a podcast of Filipino Rising, and Crystal Fabella, and she has taken amazing steps to celebrate the Filipino American culture, specifically Filipina. So having women come on to talk about their experiences, what they're doing from different careers, etc. And I found that so empowering. It's similarly, I've connected with people within my field who share that identity. Following people on Twitter, there's a huge academic Twitter space. I won't dive into that, but it's been helpful to kind of purposely fill my social media feed, what I'm consuming, to reflect those things that I want to better understand. And that's not just about my own identity, it's also understanding things outside of that bubble. So, quite frankly, I think I could have classified myself as a white feminist like about 5 years ago, where I was very much centering the white narrative, the white woman narrative in a lot of this. And now I think I've fully begun to appreciate the intersectionality of my own identity and the intersectionality of a lot of the social issues that are at the forefront of the world right now, in our society. And uh, I I've ranted to like anyone that has listened lately about that, but it's also because I can appreciate the level of learning and unlearning that is necessary to kind of challenge that old perspective and to understand that it's beyond just that white woman narrative. And I think similar to what you were saying of like understanding and having that sense of comfort, etc. Um, it's also that we were conditioned to have both feet outside of our identities. That 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and then jump both feet in. That's what society has conditioned us to do. We had to assimilate to survive. You were bullied in high school if that wasn't the case. If you didn't jump both feet in, you got to fit in. And I think it's taken this time for me to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and comfortable with challenging that and being okay with jumping in without knowing for sure that there's something to catch me.
Definitely. And like you said, we were conditioned there's a lot of things that we intake in our childhood that we have no choice in. A lot of that is societally induced, induced by the environment we grew up in. And unlearning is hard. It's harder than learning. So I guess my question is, what's the difference between what you described as white feminism versus intersectionality, the intersectionality that you recognize today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think has been a really difficult one for people to process. So when we think of white feminism, we can think of it as we're centering the white woman identity in these issues. So thinking about, for example, reproductive rights, how does that affect a white woman? That differentially affects someone of a marginalized background. So, there is no doubt about it that women in our society are not, they have not reached equity in comparison to men. We know that. Women, that is a marginalized identity. When we think of intersectionality, we can think of multiple identities in one. So Kimberly Crenshaw actually coined the term in 1989. And this is something that I realized recently is like how long these concepts have been around. This is not new. None of this is new. It's just that we haven't taken the steps as society to really normalize it. So intersectionality is really taking multiple oppressed identities and understanding that someone can have more than one. So, for example, as a half Filipino woman, that's two identities in one that are historically, systemically marginalized. If you think about people that are transgender, that's another one, disability status. We think about the LGBTQIA plus community. We think about, SES. We think about, there's
What's
so many
SCS?
socioeconomic status. I am so bad at defining all these things. So please continue to ask those questions.
Will
Um,
do.
but it's just, there's so many layers here that it's, even if we're just talking about, like, for example, if we were going to talk about the Black community, there's a lot of heterogeneity just within that community and the layers of oppression that exist within the Black community. And so it's, and then LGBTQIA plus community, same thing. And so that's why I think it's important when we're having conversations about social justice and about sociopolitical issues like reproductive rights, it's important to think about the intersectionality of the issue. How does it differentially affect communities of color? How does it differentially affect transgender women who are unable to get the same access to healthcare as a white woman? And it's, it's challenging to sit back now that I know this information and I have to catch myself and have a moment of humility. I once did not know this information. I was not educated on this. I did unlearning and learning, and I am still learning. This is a lifelong process. I don't know the experiences of people that don't reflect my identity. I only know my experience. And so it's a lot of listening, a lot of you need to take a step back. Um, but I think it's hard still to sit here and see people centering the white woman experience specifically without considering the differential impact on other communities. One of those is the Handmaid's Tale situation. And I've been very vocal on social media about this lately because that's a prime example of centering a white woman narrative that
What?
is. So have you heard of the show Handmaid's Tale?
No.
So it's basically this dystopian society in which there's decreased fertility in women just in general, and then the dystopian society is where this government overthrew the government, and it's essentially forcing the women who still are fertile to have babies for rich families. They have a really diverse cast on the surface, but they are not explicitly naming the reproductive injustices that have occurred in the context of racism, and like how racism has informed those injustices and differential experiences with reproductive rights in different communities. It does not discuss that. It does. And so it really is, again, centering the white women's experience only in this world. And sure, there are fleeting moments where they touch on some things, but it's not integrated throughout the storyline. And so for people also to then draw a parallel from what's happening right now in our country with Roe v. Wade to a fictional society also is minimizing the experiences and the historical injustices um, in reproductive rights. And I think it's hard for people who are seeing these things. They're like, oh, yeah, this really speaks to my experience without considering, okay, but my experience is as a privileged white woman. My experience is as a privileged half Filipino woman. Like, I have a lot of privilege too. It's hard to take that moment and have that introspection. Nobody is perfect at that. That is one of the hardest things to do. There's a reason why we don't purposely think about these things every day, right? It's
Yes.
exhausting.
It's
But
exhausting, and it
yeah,
can be, you might not want to face it.
yeah. You don't want to face it. It's exhausting, it's hard, it's hurtful,
Yes.
but it's necessary.
It's necessary. And a lot of other people don't want to hear it too, which is, we got to communicate what this is, what we think. We've got to define it, or, like you said, naming, or it just does, like, it could happen. Like, things can just be happening and happening and happening, and no one puts, words to them. Nothing, it just happens and happens. And it's a vicious cycle until someone defines it, people realize it, see it, and then say, no,
Mhm.
enough is enough.
Yeah, and people, it's human nature to care about things that directly impact you. And
Yes.
so I think one of the challenges in these conversations is how to make people care if it doesn't directly impact them. I think
Yes.
back to 2016, the 2016 election, and I was dating someone at the time who, when we're talking about who to vote for, you know, they said, well, I'm not going to vote. This doesn't directly impact me. Voting doesn't have any effect on me. It doesn't directly affect me. So why would I? Why would I care? That was a huge turning point for me because I was like, whoa. Because, and then I realized, what does voting mean to me? What does, caring about these issues mean to me? Is it about me specifically, or is it about the communities that it affects? And I think that's been something I think back on a lot. and think about, okay, so how do I approach a conversation with someone that might have a similar mindset as to that person that I was just describing? How do I approach those difficult conversations? And how do I have those difficult conversations with myself and have those moments of reflection?
Yeah,
Not easy.
no, not easy. A lot of places to go wrong.
Yeah. It's necessary to have the self compassion in it and
Yes.
take breaks, have self care. We're not going to move forward if we're burnt out.
No, go out kayaking in the swamps.
Right. That's been my saving grace. If I go kayaking, it's a moment of like, whew, we're taking a break, we're resetting, and we can keep moving forward. Um, but I wish my other shirt arrived. I just ordered another shirt. I have so many
Oh,
shirts
what
at this
shirt?
point. So I have
Use
a shirt that says "Your voice has power," and I love that because I think that speaks so much to my change in mindset over the last couple years. Is because I recognize how much we really do have power in our individual voices in conversations with people who may not think similar to you or have the same experiences as you, in writing letters to elected officials, hold them accountable because voting one time isn't enough. We need to hold our elected officials accountable in the system that is continuously oppressing people. Like the system is built to oppress people. And we need to hold the people that are in charge accountable if they're saying they want to change that. We also have power to have local change. That could be even in your own company, going and trying to have, you know, company-wide conversations about this. We've been doing that a lot. Obviously, I'm here independently of my department. Everything I'm saying is my own views, does not reflect the University of Florida, does not reflect the American Psychological Association. These are my views. Regardless, I've been having these conversations with my colleagues, et cetera, and that's really helped me move forward and learn from their experiences, learn how to have those difficult conversations with people with different backgrounds or of privileged backgrounds that might not get it right away. It's also been helpful for me to understand when to set a boundary and when to take that step to remove myself so that I can reset and have a more productive conversation or action otherwise. Boundaries are
yeah,
important, my friend.
boundaries are very important. Have you what have so how have you redefined or adjusted your boundaries over the last couple of years?
Oh, many ways. I don't think there's like a one size fits all type situation with that. I think first, one thing, so context is I am also in school for clinical psychology. And I think learning about a lot of therapeutic approaches to this has also been helpful for me as an individual, and also engaging in therapy myself has been really helpful for that. So I'm a huge advocate of that. And I think that's helped me recognize my own areas that need boundaries. So, first, understanding what my signs of burnout are for myself, which will look different from yours, I'm sure. So, it looks different in everyone. And then, second, learning to say no, just learning to say, hey, you know what? Actually, I don't think I have the space for this right now. That can mean taking on a new responsibility. That can mean engaging in a conversation that could be emotionally draining. Saying, like, can we table this until I'm able to really give this what it deserves? Um, that's okay. And it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to seek help in those moments. So I have really tried to work on that. I'm still working on that. I'm never going to be perfect at that. I'm always going to be a people pleaser with a slight, you know, uh,
People
tendency
pisser
to
off are
challenge, yeah,
yes,
fight the system, But
yes.
I think it's a balance, and surrounding yourself with people that will respect those boundaries. So, and what we're talking about before, finding our communities in which we feel safe, but still engaging in situations that are outside of that safe and comfort zone. So preserving our safety and ourselves, while still trying to challenge ourselves is important. So I think it's always going to be a balance. It's always going to be a push and pull. There are days I am not good at it. There are days I just want to lay in bed and not do anything. There are days I'm just like, I'm going kayaking.
Mm,
See ya, toodles. There are days
yes.
that I take it out in soccer. I'm so glad I had soccer today after this week. Um, it gets out that energy and figuring out like what works for you. That's going to be different for everyone.
Yes, that's very important. And I spoke with a friend a couple days ago, and we spoke about, having, and I made this, I alluded to, us being a cup and having our cup filled enough to be able to dispense it out to other people. And, when you and I were younger and, we were assimilating, we didn't feel comfortable with one foot in each area, and we needed to just put both feet into our American Californian lifestyles. That was so that we could be comfortable, feel safe, grow stronger. And now, however many years later, we're both in a place where we feel like our cups are filled enough to be able to give away. But as you were saying, those boundaries are so important because it's really easy to give away too much too quickly.
Oh yeah. And each time we're put in a situation that challenges that, it's almost as if there's a giant rock that's thrown in that cup and it can make it full, like spill over.
Yes.
And everyone has a different size cup too. So I think I think about that and what you're saying. I love that metaphor. I think about kind of it similarly of like we all have our own cup, we have our own bowl. Like you might have a giant mug while someone else might have a Dixie cup in that moment. And so it's important to think about, everyone is different in what they can handle. Everyone's different in where they're at in that journey. Maybe we can all, exchange that Dixie cup for a bigger cup one day as we grow. But everyone's going to be different with that. And I struggle with that big time. It's something I'm trying to work on. It's something I'm trying to be aware of. It's those individual differences, meet people where they're at. And sometimes it's okay to be frustrated if people aren't meeting you or taking those steps to meet you in the middle too. Um, but got to do what helps you to keep that cup from not overflowing.
Yes. And when we do get frustrated, like you said, applying self compassion is very important to just, all right, that's okay. I'm kind of pissed. I'm not happy, but that's okay. We're trying to do some work, and now we're going to reset those boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think here's an example is I went to the Planned Parenthood um, Bands Off Our Bodies march and rally yesterday. Like I have a really cool shirt from it. It says our bodies, our future, our abortions.
Wow.
And I think that it was a really powerful event with a lot of people that showed up of various identities, people that are directly impacted, people who are indirectly impacted, people who are there as allies. And at this, I was so empowered to see everyone coming together. And at the same time, I felt broken down by seeing some of the racist signs, racist outfits, etc. I felt broken down last night seeing a very popular local Instagram account promoting those things by posting pictures from the event that had those images at the forefront. And it was really disheartening when trying to engage in those conversations with that account, with people who were doing that, to feel dismissed. And every part of me wanted to be like, I'm going to fight. Let's take them down. Like, I want to show them that they're wrong. But I'm really glad that I took a step back after a while and had a moment where I recognized like, you can only meet someone where they are. They are not at a place where they're able to really process that information yet and do something with it. So what am I going to do? I'm going to protect my peace and set my own boundary by unfollowing those accounts. I moved after, saying something. I removed myself because I could feel it really starting to affect me in a way that I knew I wouldn't be productive. And I am still not the best at that. I'm still working on that. But that's an example that just happened yesterday.
It's always it's a skill we're always trying to hone. It's
Yeah.
never perfect, like you said.
Yeah. We're never going to be perfect. And that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Ju-
it's hard to expect perfection out of others. I often do. I often try to expect people to meet me where I'm at or, have done that work. I'm like, okay, guys, it's been like really like the hot topic for the last few years in my bubble, in my world. This is what people are always talking about. And then that's not the case for everyone.
no, it's not. And like you said, we have to meet people where they're at, and everyone's got a different size cup to fill that they can give away. And the pre-existing conditions we were all born into have a big they have big determinations on how small, how big that cup is, where the water levels starts out. It, you know, like you said, we alluded to, white feminism at one point in your thought patterns, and then evolving that into more of an intersectionality sort of thinking. There's a lot of nuance in everything. For example, I'm listening to a podcast on the North Atlantic slave trade and listening to Thomas Jefferson, a very small clip of Thomas Jefferson has, you know, a concubine. He has a sex slave, and he has several children with that slave. That slave is as much of a woman as the wife that died, that Thomas Jefferson's wife that died a few years earlier. They're both they're both cisgender women, and they both lived incredibly different lifestyles, had incredibly different standards of what could and couldn't be done. And that's a very extreme example, but for some people, like, it's very obvious. Like, for example, say abortion is criminalized in one state. A woman with a good cess, a good economic situation can leave that state probably pretty easily and then possibly find services in another state. A woman who's I'm not sure the word, but has in a low income bracket, you know that sort of travel and taking that time off can be extremely daunting, can be like nearly impossible. And
Mhm.
so there's intersectionality, there's nuance, there's complexity in everyone's case, and it's not black and white. It's not every single woman or every single person for any other law, but specifically for the recall of Roe versus Wade. It's not like this will affect women equally. Californian women are, a bit that their rights regarding their access to abortion are much, they have better, I don't want to call it privilege, but slightly privileged because that where they were born and where they were lived versus people in much more conservative, pro-life states.
Yeah, we can call it privilege. It is. We can
Yes.
name it that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, have you heard of social determinants of health? Have you heard of that before?
No, I haven't.
So it's the National Institute of Health, NIH, they've defined, and the CDC has defined social determinants of health as different factors that can influence health outcomes throughout life. And those determinants include, our neighborhood context, our social economic status, our socioeconomic status, our, education quality. It's all of these different factors that can contribute to those health outcomes. It's not just biological. And so we've seen that in the cognitive world. So our ability, thinking and memory, et cetera, that these factors can affect how well our brain is able to function and maintain levels of thinking, memory, et cetera, in older age. And these social determinants of health differentially impact marginalized communities. Why do you think that is? It's like the system that we live in, the world we live in, has differential resources available to different groups of people. And that's where we can think of oppressed identities and privileged identities, that the system continuously oppresses specific groups of people. So when I talk about the system, I mean like politically, I mean our government, I mean access to healthcare, I mean access to education. So someone who finishes high school in a very rural area without and low SES, so socioeconomic status, versus high SES, access to more resources, technology, neighborhood support, etc., like tutoring outside of school, etc. Do those two mean the same thing if you graduate high school?
No.
Yeah, and so that can really affect a lot of different things. And so when you're talking about the nuance, it's like it's not just, thinking about, okay, so racism, obviously, on the surface and how people interact with one each other, with interpersonally. That's one way of thinking about racism. But another one is, how has the system continuously affected those of marginalized identities? That's when we talk about systemic racism. And that affects all of those social determinants of health, and that affects people's access to equitable opportunities throughout life for healthcare, for positive health outcomes, for better cognition in older age, etc. Like these are things that it is really nuanced. You're absolutely right. There's a huge dedication to studying that in the research world. It's something that I recognize I cannot responsibly conduct my own research of looking at cognition in older age without, thinking about these factors and how it informs that. And at the same time, if we're thinking about Roe v. Wade and people, the example you said, if it's criminalized in one state, someone's ability to travel to another state is dependent on so many different things. It's dependent on their neighborhood context, their SES status, do they have the access to another state where they're able to travel to get the same services, and also thinking about timing. So abortion is healthcare. If we think about medical abortion emergencies where it's an ectopic pregnancy, so that the egg is fertilized in the fallopian tube, and that is a medical emergency. What are you going to do in that situation? Is someone going to have the time in an emergency status to be able to go across multiple states and travel to go get an abortion in that situation? Probably not. And so thinking about, okay, so what communities is this most likely going to affect in those situations? And also, how are they going to detect that in the first place? That's where like clinics like Planned Parenthood are so valuable. They can detect that in the first place. They can provide the health care necessary to have a healthy pregnancy, to have the abortion access that you need. And it's the woman's choice. If they decide, that they're in a situation where they are unable to provide for a baby and they make that choice, that's their choice. That's their autonomy. Personally, I want to just say upfront, I have no religious background or tied to religion that informs my beliefs on this. So I respect those who would say absolutely not, I would never, but it is everyone's choice, in my opinion, to make that decision. But regardless, it is healthcare, so we should have the option. Um, I do just want to say that I have gone to a Planned Parenthood before for just basic medical needs when I didn't have an established provider here yet. They were close by, they could take me that day, and I just needed to make sure I could get an appointment so I could refill medication. And I didn't have access to any healthcare provider yet here besides student health. And I personally just wanted to go somewhere else. And that's my choice and my freedom to do so. It was the best healthcare I have ever received. They took the time to sit down with me, explain what they were doing. I have never felt more heard. The turnaround time of tests, the turnaround time, and them listening to my concerns about side effects from a medication, I've never had that in any other provider. And I think that speaks to Planned Parenthood and abortion clinics, et cetera, as providing health care. Abortion is health care in that situation too. And so, yeah, I went in for medication. Someone else might need to have access to healthcare like abortion in that situation. And it's great that these clinics exist to do that. And I full heartedly believe that that needs to continue. And that
Absolutely.
is my rant.
Well, it's a good rant. And a lot of women, a lot of people in general, but I think, you know, this this topic, it affects women's bodies. Frankly, men, cisgender men cannot, this does not affect us so much. It is not like we carry this burden. It's not like we have the chance to have an egg inserted into our fallopian tube and start developing. It's not like, we could die from pregnancy. I took many trips to Africa
Mhm.
3 or 4 years ago. And one of my trips back, I was sitting next to a Sengali woman, and I asked, "Hey, why are you going to why'd you go to Africa?" And her sister had died in childbirth. And it's not like it's a big deal. One, two, if a woman doesn't feel like she can take care of a child, there's a high likelihood that child may end up in an orphanage. And I mean, I saw a high profile individual on Twitter post, I don't know, something, it was like less abortions and more adoptions. And I thought that was a reckless thing to say because, one, that just doesn't happen. Like, people just don't start adopting just because there are less abortions in the world. It's going to be that there are more orphans in the world, more likely. And then these individuals who are going to be born in that orphanage, like, it's, people will say, give, it's their life. You're taking away their chance at life. That's a very, very hot topic. And that's, like you said, it can be a religious debate and whatnot. But frankly, I think orphans have a high likelihood to be targets for sexual predators, for drug dealers, for people who want to get individuals on drugs, for criminals in general. It's really easy if someone doesn't have anyone taking care of them. I I can't, I've only heard nightmare stories of them, so I can't really speak to it, but this is just my thinking. And also, I would imagine that some people are going to have an abortion regardless of whether or not it's legal or not legal. And
Oh yeah, this is just for safe abortions and
exactly.
in a situation where they have the healthcare resources to help with that. Also, to your point about orphanages and orphans, etc. Look at the foster care system and how broken it is, right?
Is it
Like,
broken?
oh yeah, oh yeah. Like if you think about foster care in kids that are in foster care, if you just think about, someone who never they are going from home to home where oftentimes foster parents don't have the resources to be able to care for as many kids that are coming in. And, you know, talk about another system that is not supporting the people in it. I think that is an admirable thing to be able to be a foster parent and try to support kids. But again, the system isn't built to be able to give as much support as you want. So, exactly what you're saying, that think about all the kids that are going to, if they're put up for adoption, adoption is not necessarily an answer, right? So, yeah, I agree with you on that big time.
Yes. So what do you think the step forward is? What do you think, we do from here? And I mean, is Roe versus Wade will be repealed? Won't will it not? Or do you know what's going on there?
Yeah, so as of right now, abortion is still legal. It is still Roe v. Wade is still, intact. Like, what we saw was a leaked draft opinion, and that means that it is not formally overturned. Now, realistically, this is something that has been discussed in this world of reproductive rights advocacy for a while. Is that, like, yeah, this is something that's going to happen, especially with kind of the shift that we've seen in our government, in our elected officials, et cetera, and the continued narrative of vote, vote me in and I'll protect this. But then they get in office and then it's, oh, vote again. um, it's, we know that this is likely going to happen. Now, realistically, what can we do in that moment is continue to push for codifying Roe v. Wade. So I know that in Congress, they tried to push forward codifying Roe v. Wade recently, and it did not go through. But that's where like what I was saying before, your voice has power. So continue to contact your representatives, continue to push, continue to advocate,
What is
educate.
codifying?
So it means that you're going to make it permanent.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is, but continue to have conversations with people that might think differently. Um, Continue to, I think, fight misinformation. I think continue to help people understand that this is a basic healthcare right. I think that it's important to continue to try to hold everyone accountable here. So sign up to volunteer with clinics like Planned Parenthood. Sign up to go to like volunteer to help spread information about this. Again, write your legislators, write your state representatives, because again, if this does get overturned, it goes to the states. So there's a lot of what we call trigger states where they are completely criminalizing abortion if it is overturned immediately. It goes into effect immediately. And so know if your state is one of those and then contact your officials. Continue to fight your state representatives to try to make that not the case. Like I know Florida is not one of those trigger states. However, it is something that could be possible in the future. So I think continuing to try to not just fight at the federal level, but state level as well. And then, help the clinics that will continue to support people that need it. Continue to, donate to abortion funds. There's, I can give you the information that maybe you can put with this recording about places that you can donate. The National Abortion Funds is one where you can find. I know you can donate to 6 at once and split your donation across 6 different funds. You can find local abortion clinics that you can donate to have more of a local effect. Um, but the fight's not over. It's not going to be over. And even if it is overturned, ultimately, not going to stop. Like, this is something we can continue to fight for. Um, don't take that as a final word.
My guest today has been Nicole Evangelista. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.